Thank you for listening to my book, Trick Baby. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it. Chapter 1, Trick Baby Arrives. My first dream or impression of this life is me slipping off a cloud saying, "Oh, this should be easy." I slipped down to a mother who wouldn't admit she was pregnant, even to her own sister. I was born on Halloween night on my grandmother Lottie's 80th birthday. Arrived right at trick-or-treat time, and I was referred to as the Trick Baby. Born in a lumber baron's house acting as a hospital, the doctor went off to see Gone with the Wind while my mother labored. My father's family came from St. Petersburg, Russia, and landed in All Saints-Lorraine on the border of Switzerland and France. Around 1850, the family left the Catholic Church in Europe and headed to Canada, partially because great-great-grandmother refused to speak German again. They were to stay 7 years and become Canadian citizens. But somewhere in there, an affair erupted between lovers, and off they snuck into Michigan. They crossed a frozen Lake Huron and walked into the thumb of Michigan. Great-grandfather Stephen started a lumber business which all the family worked. As a third-generation logger, my father, then 5 years old, was expected to arrive 30 seconds before the noon bell with a bucket of beer for the workers. This would be about 1912. He said he had a hard time not slopping it since he was so young, but the men would harass him so if he was late. Grandmother Lottie had 1 girl and then 5 boys, my father being near the tail. I always felt sorry for the 1 girl, Nellie, as I'm sure all she did was work. For the children's after-school snack, Dad's mother Lottie would set out bacon grease and dried bread on a wood stove at the back door. She had a huge porcelain sink that hung off the wall of the kitchen. She also had built-in cupboards and a very creepy basement. Lottie was born in 1874. There was a massive fire that burned 4 counties at the tip of the thumb in 1881, fed by a brush fire left by the logging industry. Her father placed all the children and possessions in the root cellar, which he had built outside. It was a room dug halfway into a hill and then covered with dirt. This helped keep the temperature down to 55 most of the years and maybe keep everything from freezing too hard in the winter. The fire was fed by a great windstorm and quickly jumped from structure to structure. Trees, houses, barns, carriages, gardens, and all the fields were consumed by the great fire. As they stood in the root cellar, great-grandfather worried and at the last possible moment lowered the children down into the well. There they stood for hours as the fire consumed all but their lives. When they emerged from the well, the root cellar was completely burned out. Door, shelves, and all the food was gone. Lottie said they ate baked potatoes right out of the field for the next few days. The smoke from the fire enveloped the east coast and caused a yellow hue, which afterwards they called Yellow Day, or for some reason whispered Saffron Curtain. The fire burned 1 million acres, left 15,000 homeless, and killed 250 or more, as so many people were undocumented. This was the first disaster for the American Red Cross to manage. Poor little Lottie stayed fearful of the wind her whole life and instilled that fear in me for many years. I can still get spooked. Dad said when he was young and the wind was a-howling, she would make the kids check the roof over and over for fire until the wind died down. Did you ever see a house with a ladder attached to the roof leading up to the chimney? This is to check the roof and chimneys for fires. Lottie's old house eventually got indoor plumbing, but the old outhouse stood silently on the side of the garden for many years after, and I knew and loved it well. I would always examine its contents before sitting down. I would try to guess whose poop each plop was. The old worn seats felt welcoming, and I would sit with the door open watching the world go by as I did my duty. My sister Jane was grossed out by my behavior, but I enjoyed the solitude, a few minutes of respite. I felt connected to the long light of shitters before me. Out back was a path to the lumber yard and cement mixing facility. My uncles ran the businesses, and walking in the front door was like walking back in time, even for the life we lived then. The floors creaked and the doors squeaked just like you would imagine. The shelves were handmade with wide planked boards filled sparingly with paint supplies, tools, and whatnots. As I left the outhouse one day, I spied a beautiful single peach hanging from a small, unkept peach tree. It glistened in the sun, begging me to pluck it. It was the best peach I had ever eaten, and possibly the best peach I would ever eat. All juicy, I walked into the lumber yard and immediately saw several men looking at me with shock and then envy. I knew then that they had all been watching the peach and wondering who would get the pleasure of plucking it from the tree. And print right. My mother's family came from England. She was quite English, rotten teeth and all. Her maiden name was Tewkesbury. There's a Tewkesbury Castle and a minor Tewkesbury War. Her father and mother bought a farm south of Kingston near a major swamp. It had a long driveway, a small house, and a barn for animals and a barn for feed. They had 3 girls at the time. First to be born was Eleanor, then Erie, then my mother Reva. Her mother was pregnant with her first child when she tumbled down the basement steps and died, though exactly how is unknown to me. If she had dislodged the placenta, she would have bled to death fairly quickly. My mother told of a vision she had of herself sitting in the high chair and her mother, Bertha, crossing the room in front of her all dressed in black. I have wondered if she's confusing the funeral attire of the women who would show up immediately. Maybe her mother had actually made it up the steps and was crossing the kitchen for something to help herself with, or just headed to a bed. How long did mother sit in the high chair till help arrived? Who ran for help? Was grandfather around? Maybe in the barn? There would be no medical help as they lived 10 miles or more to the nearest facility, which would not have been a hospital, but maybe a doctor in a house. By horse-drawn or carriage, this would have been an impossible situation. She would have had to be an airlift to the nearest Trauma 1 trauma center, which did not exist at the time. Even today, she would have to be flown to Ann Arbor, over 100 miles away. She was doomed the moment her foot slipped off that step. They divided the kids up and sent them to cousins for a couple of years. Grandfather Harvey remarried a woman to care for the children and I guess service him. He was a cranky old man that would slap you hard if you squirmed on his lap at all. We often stayed over at their house, and my step-grandmother Ann had a pea pot for us upstairs that we would use at night. I swear it's the same pea pot my mother used for beans after Ann died. That pot had a storied history that ended with a druggie stealing it from a yard sale my sister and I were having. He picked it up, marked 10 cents, and carried it oh so carefully in front of him as he walked back up the driveway towards the road. We laughed. But right afterwards, a woman came running back looking for a wad of bills she had dropped. It was her daughter's pay for the week, and it lay right on the escape route used by the druggie. So while he was stealing a 10-cent pot, he missed the mother load. I'm pretty sure that old bean pot ended its life making crack cocaine. After grandmother Bertha died, the years passed, and my mother and her sister Eleanor married 2 brothers, Albert and Robert. They seemed to get along through the years, something my dad struggled with doing with his other brothers and 1 sister. I think he could be pretty pig-headed and wipe people out of his life. I walked by my uncle's house every day but was rarely invited in. If it was just mother and me, maybe we would be invited in for an evening drink or some conversation. Even his 1 sister barely gave him the time of day. Mother and Dad owned an independent insurance office. Dad always claimed it was his and would rarely mention Mother's involvement, but we knew the truth. He had the certificate, but she ran the business, which meant he sold and signed the policies and she did everything else. She trained the girls that she hired. Yes, they were always called girls. She caught Dad's errors. One day he insured a farm for $100,000 when it should have been $1 million. She said it scared her, so she bought errors and omissions insurance for themselves. She trained 1 girl for several years until she could sell, bill, file, collect, and pay the insurance company. When she left, she interviewed at an agency over to Saginaw, and they pushed her up several levels during the interview. They were impressed with her experience and understanding the whole cycle of the operation. She called Mother after the interview, thrilled, thanking her profusely for the training. Mother dissuaded her own daughters from working in the office. I wonder if she was actually discriminating against herself in her own career. She shouldn't have, as she handled the office beautifully. Mother was very community-oriented and worked many years to get our little town a park and an ambulance service. Both took a long time and had many operations that had to come together. The ambulance was of particular interest as so many people then died waiting for the ambulance. The committee also had to find and train EMS personnel. Eventually we had an ambulance and it was parked in the driveway of the EMS driver. The park was a trial to bring about also, as they had to figure out property and buy equipment and get it all put together. They were successful. My brother and others worked on getting the train station installed in the park, and the town ended up with a great historical display and meeting room. After this, they started a fall festival and had a place to gather near the edge of town. Oh, I wish I had a recording of the one time I attended the fall festival. First, you had to buy your tickets for the cow plop and either watch or come back later to see if you had won and then pick up your shit. To play, you would pick a square from a portable barnyard and wait for the cows to plop on your square. Next, we had it up to the tire burning contest. Not exactly what you were thinking. The tires were on the car when this happens. The town cop would spray the asphalt on the hill heading up to the high school with water and bleach. Then a contestant would drive up right beside the cop and start burning their tires. Smoke rolled off the tires with the back end of the car jumping slightly, and the cop just stands right there by the driver's window talking to the driver. If they were really good, the back seat and then the front seat filled up with smoke too. We stood on hay wagons watching. The smoke was thick and dark and stank. Everyone cheered as people ate up $500 worth of rubber. All shapes and forms of vehicles showed up to participate. I watched and listened to several transmissions fail, especially the old Winnebago. Everyone cheered when it pulled up and knew instantly the old transmission wouldn't make it long. The crowd was right, and they had to call in the waiting tow truck to get the Winnebago removed. The laughter alone was worth the admission. Nobody back in the city would understand this. Poor city people don't know what fun is all about. It wouldn't be clean enough or smell pretty enough or provide a nice enough chair. Somebody might chip a nail climbing onto the hay wagon or sneeze because of the dust. Oh my. My dad hated talking about cars when he was out selling insurance, so he devised a plan. He would buy the same make, model, and color of car over and over so it would go unnoticed. A Pontiac Star Chief was his preference. We would change the name to Fire Chief, as that was the position he often held. His days as a volunteer fireman were funny, if not so tragic. First, they never planned on stopping any fires. Their whole focus was to contain the fire. As an example, Dad and Ivan Hunt went to a house fire just east of town. The fire was burning in the living room when they came in the back door with the fire hose into the kitchen. The old man who lived there was a pig at best. He had chickens in the house and he had dirty dishes everywhere. By the sink was a single dirty bed. Ivan put his arm across the door and stopped Dad in the doorway and said, "Well, the first thing we have to do is the dishes." He pulled back the handle of that fire hose and sprayed the dishes off the countertop and out of the sink and onto the floor and onto the bed. When the kitchen was completely cleaned of dishes, Ivan turned the hose off and said to my dad, "Now, where's the fire?" My oldest brother was born in Pontiac in the late 1930s. Mom and Dad were doing well enough to build a house, and I think life was pretty good. Mom's Uncle Clyde had gotten Dad into Fisher Body. This was before they got into insurance, so work and money were stable. He had gotten into Fisher Body as a woodworker. The interviewer asked Dad how much of a woodworker he was. Dad responded that he knew enough about woodworking for the little bit of wood they were using on the new cars. The man thought that was funny and hired him. Dad didn't have much of a work history, as he had only worked the farm and the lumberyard, delivered milk, or removed alcohol from the undercarriages of cars after they smuggled liquor across the Canadian border. Even in those days, this was not a good addition to a resume. He delivered milk when he first went to Detroit in 1919. His job was to drive a horse-drawn wagon to the stores and put the milk in the ice coolers. His first day on the job, he pulled up to a store situated in a city block, grabbed his delivery, and headed into the store. It took him a few minutes to load the coolers, and when he returned to the street, the horse and the wagon were gone. He searched up and down the street looking. Most of the men came out to help. What Dad didn't know was that the horse knew the route, and as soon as Dad had grabbed the milk and gone inside, the horse pulled around back and stood there waiting for Dad. Well, Dad was in a panic, running up and down the street looking for his lost charge. Soon the men were laughing, and he expanded his search only to find the horse out back with a "where the heck you been" look on his face. Dad learned this initiation trick pretty well and would torture the new hires in Fisher Body, sending the new boys to find a left-hand screwdriver. He'd tell the new hires to ask everyone, as a left-hand screwdriver is very rare. He would have the whole line laughing at some young buck, a term he liked to call these men, which wasn't very nice. When the oldest Richard was 7 years old, Mother had a second child. Contrary to current practices, Mother said not a word about the pregnancy. As far as Richard knew, Mother just disappeared for 10 days and then showed up with this whiny, crying thing that consumed all of her attention. Soon he was asking if they could take Robert back to the hospital. In the world of child development, this is a Class 1 offense to the oldest child. No time to adjust. No time to coming around to being the big brother status. He just got a moment to realize he was now sharing his incredibly comfortable life with it. Robert was second fiddle to Richard for sure, but the girls were third fiddle at best. The boys were my mother's world. Even after the boys left for college, we had to save 2 bedrooms for them. This meant the 3 of us were crammed in a 1-bedroom, a double bed in my crib, a high boy dresser from Grandmother Peter, and a dressing table with a skirt and a little sitting table. We had a walk-in closet at the back of the upstairs that connected to the other bedroom. We had no doors on the rooms and thus not a lot of privacy. There was a small hobbit door that led to the attic, a place you never wanted to get locked into. Before Robert left for college, he stole a reflective eye off a billboard sign downtown. The billboard had been erected on the west side of the bar, which made it slightly visible as you came into town and up the hill. I was not aware of this, but I found the eye upstairs in his bedroom the next morning. This eye winked at you when you moved it, and I played with it all morning. It was quite a toy for an isolated kid. When my parents came home for lunch, the missing eye was the topic of conversation. Oh, how horrible. It was cute on that billboard. Who would do this? On and on they complained over lunch. I sat there putting the whole story together. I could be rather dense at the time, but I was putting it all together. I knew Robert would physically punish me if I told where I found the eye. But I wanted to tell because it would be so much fun to rat him out. I really wanted to see Mother's reaction finding out that her own son had stolen the eye. It was her precious son. But I did not tell. When Robert got home, I snuck upstairs and told him that I did not tell. He was mildly impressed, but not really believing me. I never saw the eye again. He did give me a little pat on the back. I was so pleased with myself, but the reward was thin for the excitement I had given up. I felt a little cheated. Marilyn came next on St. Patrick's Day, 1946. The day she was to come home, they had a huge snowstorm, which made the whole affair scary, and they talked about it often. Marilyn was the apple of my mother's eye. She loved her, but expected way too much from her. Marilyn was to keep house clean and manage from an early age. She became quite rebellious with boyfriends. She would infuriate my parents with sitting in the driveway necking. Mother and Dad would give the steam report to each other as they snuck past the porch windows to catch a glimpse of the action. I remember my dad saying once, "Well, they're all fogged up now." Jane came way too early. Mother said she was only 6 months pregnant. She said, "A woman knows these things." Dad had taken Mother to the Catholic hospital in Detroit when they got her labor under control and sent Dad home. But by the time he got home, the phone was a-ringing and the baby had arrived terribly early, and they wanted Dad back at the hospital immediately to name the baby and be there for baptism. They assumed she would die and felt adamant she must be baptized to prevent her from going to hell. Dad said she looked like a skinned rabbit. He named her right there in the hallway, telling the nuns his favorite name was Jane Ann, and so she was named, baptized, and placed in a nun's arm for care. I think this was the most Catholic thing anyone had done in the family for 2 generations. For my dad to worry about her baptism, he must have really loved that little girl. I don't know how they did it, but they saved that little 2-pound girl in 1950 with barely any equipment. We didn't even have pediatric needles in the 1950s. But save her they did. 12 weeks later, and with crippled children paying the bill, Mother and Dad brought Jane home. Later, Crippled Children's Fund found out that Jane survived pretty well and was not crippled. At that point, they demanded their money back, so Mother paid $7 a month for 100 months. It was probably a year's wages or more, but Mother was glad to pay it. After Jane was born is when my dad bought his father-in-law's insurance business. It was located up in the thumb of Michigan, back in his hometown of Kingston. He had to get certification to learn how to sell the policies, and he would drive back to Pontiac on the weekends and eventually bought the old farmhouse where I grew up. Once he had the house, Mom started going up on weekends. Driving in the 1950s required a lot of upper body strength. The cars were not equipped with power steering or power brakes. The suspension was weak at best, and the big old heavy cars would fight you all the way down the road. Add to this our inability to make a flat road bed. Most roads dipped and twisted like a poorly laid ribbon. So for Mother to drive all the way up from Pontiac to Kingston was really a testament to her strength and determination. These were hard years, but she wanted to keep the kids in Pontiac schools as long as possible. My birth was more like an accident you don't want to talk about. I have this great image of my Aunt Eleanor walking in the back door, seeing Mom in maternity clothes for the first time, and being somewhat shocked. Eleanor was a gentle soul who had her own trials and tribulations. She and my mother had married brothers, and they all remained close throughout the years. She had a double mastectomy in the 1930s because she had dense breasts, and I guess that's all the doctor knew what to do. Then she had a baby whom the family always whispered the doctor had killed during delivery. When she had no baby and no breasts, her milk filled her neck. She always seemed sad. Mother had so many children she didn't know what to do, but sharing a little workload with Eleanor made her feel incompetent, so she kept her kids close. Telling her sister she was pregnant again was probably hard, so she delayed it until she could no longer hide her condition. Mother had been given a shower for my birth, which was quite taboo at the time. A woman got a shower for the first child and nothing more. Mother was quite adamant about this until I questioned her about her shower and the more womanly presents she had received. She avoided the questions. She avoided so many questions.